So I first came across you at the National Secular Society conference where you were
Right.
talking about circumcision. Um, and it was a brilliant talk. And I came in with that sort of very arrogant, headstrong way of thinking, like, no, there's no comparison between male circumcision and FGM. And I was kind of quite like pig-headed when I went in, and then you completely changed my mind. So I thought that would be a good thing to talk about.
Sure. Yeah.
For people that don't know anything about this area, what is circumcision?
Yeah. I'll just say that your reaction, your initial thought is very understandable because that's what I thought going into all this as well. So when people say FGM, which you just mentioned, they are referring to something called female genital mutilation, which is the World Health Organization's term for a whole bunch of different practices that they kind of lump together under this one label. So when most people hear that, they're thinking of the forms of that kind of cutting that are held up in Western media, which are usually the most extreme or shocking. And a lot of that has to do with kind of the bias of media to pick examples of things that are likely to be scintillating and tantalizing to their readers, sometimes which has this kind of orientalizing gaze on other cultures where it's trying to pick the examples that make them seem the most barbaric. And so there's a little bit of that going on in the background, which is a problem. There are forms of female genital cutting, or as folks in the cultures who practice it might say, female circumcision, that are relatively less severe than male circumcision, which is what you're talking about now. So you have to figure out which kind you're comparing with which kind. But so in the male case, male circumcision usually refers to the partial or total removal of the penile foreskin, which is it's about the bottom third of the skin system of the penis, the part that covers the head of the penis. And so this tissue is analogous to the clitoral hood, which covers and protects the external part of the clitoris. And so, the tissue starts out the same embryologically, and then it diverges depending on which sex the child becomes. And so this tissue is much larger in the case of males just because the organ is bigger externally, but it's the same kind of tissue. It's protective, it's sensitive, it's just part of the normal complement of the genitals that people are born with. But in some cultures, there's a tendency to remove part or all of this tissue, either in boys or in girls.
Okay. And where does it originate? Where and when did it originate?
Yeah, so genital cutting of both boys and girls originates in prehistory, probably in Africa, and people don't know exactly where, maybe Central Africa, maybe North Africa. And so it predates both Judaism and Islam, but was absorbed into those cultures. And still today, wherever you see female genital cutting done, there's also male genital cutting done in those same cultures. So some people think that probably as a rite of passage for boys, there was this ceremony that involved a kind of a sacrifice, something that was supposed to be painful, supposed to be difficult to go through to prove that you deserve to be a man in that society. And so some societies still have just the rite of passage for boys. So in Judaism, well, there's some Ethiopian Jews who seem to practice both male and female circumcision, but for the most part, Judaism just practices male circumcision. There are some sects of Islam, but not others, that practice both. And then in the African context, it's usually a parallel rite of passage for boys and girls. And so what some people think is that the female ritual was ultimately, 1,000 years ago or more, introduced an imitation of the male rite of passage as something so that the girls could similarly have a kind of right to build solidarity and bonding amongst themselves. And so rather ironically, because the way that we mostly hear about female genital cutting now is that it's an instrument of patriarchy, some people think it's actually an instrument of resistance against gender inequality. So the women had their own rite of passage where the wisdom of grandmothers would be passed down to the next generation, and the girls would form bonds with each other that would be a source of power that they could have within the political sphere. And so then, of course, what happens is once you have a ritual in place, and so this is one view of how these rituals may have started, is as a rite of passage to show, like any kind of hazing rite, basically. You might have this in a fraternity today. You have some horrible thing that the people go through. And why do you do that? Because if they get through the other side, they think to themselves, well, gee, that must have been worth it. I mean, in order for me to be a part of this awesome club, I had to do this really horrible thing. And so it creates a sense of real commitment to the group. And so this is one such thing, and there are many different kinds of initiation rites that exist in different cultures, but cutting the genitals is one of them. And there's different views about the symbolic meaning. It might have to do with a recognition that this is a part of the body that's related to reproduction. And so if reproduction of the culture is symbolically related to reproduction of, you know, each individual, there's some way to maybe get the symbolism off the ground. But once a practice is in place, the meanings change and morph over the centuries and the millennia, and even sometimes over the decade. And they're different from family to family, and they're different from culture to culture. So, so nowadays, if you have a highly misogynistic culture, for example, sometimes you'll get the really strongly patriarchal messages that we all hear about and that we're familiar with in this context. That may be kind of layered on top of these pre-existing genital cutting rites. But people should be aware that these rites go back thousands of years, and nobody really knows for sure what the original symbolic meanings were, but they seem to have been initially a sort of parallel rite for boys and girls.
No, that's absolutely fascinating. I've never heard that actually about it being a kind of rite of passage for women as well as men. In fact, I'd never heard of it in both male or female. So it's absolutely fascinating. So in terms of boys and men, do you know why they're circumcised? What are the justifications? What were they historically, and what are they now?
Yeah, it's interesting. They do change. So just to take the example of Judaism, there's this very famous philosopher and doctor named Moses Maimonides, who's this great interpreter of Jewish law. And he has a famous passage where he says, well, what really is the purpose of circumcision? We have the theological explanation, what exactly it says in Genesis and so forth. But he says, let's just talk about the more causal history within our group and the symbolic value of this practice. And he says, the original point of circumcision within Judaism, on his view, was to, as he says, dull the sexual organ. The idea is to diminish sensations so that the child will be less likely to want to masturbate, essentially, or to find sexual activity too enjoyable. And by diminishing that aspect of things, then the child will turn his attention to more spiritual matters. And so, you know, in many cultures, there's this thought that sexuality is something that ought to be tempered. Now, in the current kind of post-sexual revolution Western world, we tend to think that people should just enjoy sex as much as possible, and it's all about freedom and liberation. And, you know, that's my view. But I think it's not crazy to understand that some cultures who think that there's a whole bunch of values in life and who recognize that sexual feeling and expression and pleasure can be ecstatic and therefore be the sort of thing you might want to pursue to the exclusion of other activities, you can see why these traditions were developed, saying that it's not a bad thing to temper the sexual impulse or to try to make it a little bit less enjoyable to have sex, but still enjoyable. That's the idea. Now, in the 1960s, when attitudes about sexuality changed quite a lot, you start to suddenly notice that the sexual implications of male circumcision get changed in terms of how people talk about it. So right up into the 1960s, if you look at the medical literature in the United States, for example, doctors were still advocating male circumcision as an anti-masturbation technique. And their argument was that the same kind of a thing. There were negative attitudes toward especially juvenile expressions of sexuality. And so starting in the late 1800s, some very prominent US medical professionals were advocating that boys be circumcised and that girls have carbolic acid applied to their clitorises, just to discourage children from touching themselves. And the thought was that what they thought was excitation of nervous tissue caused all sorts of illnesses. So this is something known as the nerve force theory of disease. And it's not the theory of disease we have now, but they thought that if you stimulate certain kinds of tissues, this would irritate the nervous system and cause all sorts of problems, from blindness to joint problems and so forth. So they thought if we could just get these kids to stop touching themselves, which was also conveniently religiously recommended, there was this alliance then between the kind of primitive medical norms and the religious restrictions against sexual expression that kind of came together in this unholy or holy alliance, I guess, and promoted circumcision as an anti-sexual measure. And then in the 1960s, there's the whole sexual revolution, and people thought, well, maybe we shouldn't be trying to punish people for sexual exploration. And so then all these kind of rationales drop out of the medical literature, and then all the subsequent literature says, oh, it has no effect on sexual expression. It's, you know, perfectly benign and so forth. But that's something that's a very recent view. For most of the history within the West and within Judaism and within that tradition, male circumcision was seen as an anti-sexual measure.
Okay. So what age does circumcision usually take place?
Mm-hmm. So probably about a third of the world's males are circumcised, and most of that happens within Islam. Mm-hmm. And it depends on the community, but probably the average is around 6 or 7. So it's kind of still like a rite of passage, but it's actually quite difficult because when you're 7, you're still very, very vulnerable, but you're also conscious. And so, as an example, this is not, it's done in the Philippines, actually through a different kind of religious lineage. But in the Philippines, it's boys of 8 or 9 or 10 will be held down on like school tables in a kind of mass ceremony, and it's quite traumatic. So for them, they're awake, they're being held down by a loved one. They may or may not have adequate anesthesia, and they recognize that the genitals are part of their sexual organs, even though they're not really sexual beings. And then they just have this very painful thing, and you can see videos and pictures, and they're screaming, and it's horrible. And a colleague of mine has done some research to suggest that the rate of post-traumatic stress disorder among this group is something like 70%. I mean, it's just like a super traumatic experience. So that's how it's done among, in the Philippines in a rite called tuli. In the Islamic world, it's often done in part of a ceremony where they dress up the boy and put on like a king's hat and so forth. And it's all part of saying, this is going to turn you into a man and so forth. And so it's meant to be a rite of passage, but it's not done around puberty. It's done earlier than puberty. In the African context, mostly still done around puberty for both boys and girls, although there's a very wide age range. Within Judaism, the tradition is to do it on the 8th day after birth, so it's done very young. And so the two cultures that do circumcision really early is the Jewish world, Israel, and the United States, which also does it in infancy. There's some reasons why the US switched to infancy. Basically, it's just more convenient for the doctor because the child's smaller and easier to hold down. And so it was kind of part of an assembly line practice that obstetricians came up with as a way to more efficiently circumcise a whole bunch of babies. They said, we'll just do it right after birth as part of the birth process while they're already in the hospital. So the age range depends on the culture, but there's sort of two groups, infancy and then often sort of it's 8 or 9, and then as a rite of passage in some cultures where it's more like the early teenage years.
I remember seeing the kind of the thing that they kind of restrain small children in, and it just made me think. There was an image that came out of Indonesia of a small girl that was being circumcised, and like all of her kind of arms and legs were being held in the same way. So it was exactly the same image that transported into my mind. I also remember when I was quite young, I was in my teens, and one of my cousins was circumcised when he was days old. And before that, I'd been helping with nappy changes and all of that kind of stuff. And I remember even as a child thinking, I don't want to go anywhere near him because I know he's in pain. I didn't really understand, I didn't understand either thing, female circumcision or male circumcision. I just knew that I didn't want to be near him. And it really frightened me. I didn't really want to be engaging with him in the same way as I did before his circumcision. So even not having undergone it myself, not having had any experiences of it myself, somehow I knew that it wasn't right. But as a kid, I wouldn't have even known the words to use. But you're right, the kind of the implements that are used are kind of the same. I think you in the presentation had shown some of the tools and the kind of restraining implements that are used. Actually quite traumatic to even see in a weird way. It was kind of some kind of very uncomfortable feelings seeing the tools displayed in front of me. So what are the similarities and differences between male circumcision and female cutting?
Right. So there's about 12 different kinds of female genital cutting, and I'll touch on some of the main ones. But you have to kind of compare each one to each one. So the similarities and differences depend on what you're comparing. So maybe I'll start with male genital cutting because there are relatively fewer kinds of it. So the predominant practice that involves cutting of the penis is circumcision, and that can be done in different ways. So in the United States, it's done in a hospital environment, and as it is done in some other parts of the world. But I'm most familiar with the U.S. practice. So in the U.S. practice, the child will be put into this restraining device that you mentioned. It's called a circumstraint, but their arms and their legs are strapped into this device. Up until the 1980s, no anesthesia would have been used, because there was this view in the medical profession that babies didn't feel pain. They thought that basically if babies were going to come through the birth canal, it must be the case that they have some sort of defense against pain or something like that. This is now known to be totally wrong. So babies feel pain, if anything, more acutely than adults do, because their nervous system hasn't yet pruned kind of some of the pain sensors. And so some doctors, especially younger ones, now know that they need to use pain control. And so some of them will use the most powerful form of pain control, which is something called a dorsal penile nerve block. And it's something that unfortunately you have to inject with a large needle in several times into the base of the penis. So this itself can be very painful. Then you're supposed to wait several minutes for this to set in. Some doctors don't. And so they'll often sort of start the procedure before the pain control has fully set in. I'm sorry to be so graphic, but the first thing you have to do is the foreskin in young boys is fused to the head of the penis at birth. And the reason why is it's like your fingernail is fused to your finger. It's protecting the rest of the organ. It's keeping contaminants out. And it's supposed to stay that way for some number of years. It may gradually, there are these adhesions that will break down, maybe by the time they're 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. Sometimes it can take till puberty, and it just has to do with, their own developmental path. But if you want to try to get the foreskin off in infancy, you have to separate these structures with a blunt probe. And so it's just like if you were to wedge something between your fingernail and your finger to pry your fingernail off. It's excruciating for the child to have this blunt probe scraped around. And even if they have pain control, they'll often be able to feel that. Now, I think a lot of people think, well, it's a baby, so, babies don't remember anything. But of course, it's very hard to study what's going on in the mind of a baby. We have an epistemic gap, which is that we know what it's like to be us, and we have memories starting by the time we're, 4 or something that we can kind of call back. But the baby is doing all sorts of stuff. It has to learn how to be in the world and form basic attachments and process stimuli. I mean, the baby's actually doing quite a lot of fascinating stuff that we take for granted. And so these early traumatic experiences, we don't know how to measure their effects, but we have very good theoretical reasons to think that early experiences of pain are not good for babies. So you have to remove the foreskin from its adhesive connection to the head of the penis with an instrument, and then they'll apply a clamp of some kind or another to cut off the blood supply to the foreskin. And so there's different clamps that different people use. There's something called the Gomco clamp, which is most common in the U.S. And so you apply just a great amount of force, you cut off the blood supply, and then when it's kind of reached the right place, you'll use a scalpel or a razor of some kind, and you'll cut off all the tissue. I think what people don't realize is then that creates a wound. I mean, so you have to figure out how to first stop the bleeding. The head of the penis is now raw and red, and so you have to apply petroleum jelly and a bandage. And so you have this natural protective piece of the body that's there. You then remove that, create a wound, and then wrap a bandage around it to re-protect that part of the body while it heals. And then of course the baby is in diapers. So over the next couple of weeks, while they have this wound that you've created on their body, they were fine. Now you have to tend to the wound care when you have urine and feces that can now potentially infect the wound. You also have the urinary opening, the urethra, which is exposed to these abrasive, to urine and so forth. And so it can become inflamed, and it can become smaller, and then it can become harder to pass urine. So this is creating a lot of kind of complications in an area where the organ knows what it's supposed to be doing. It's already got everything figured out. So that's how it's done in the U.S. As a rite of passage in, say, Sierra Leone or something like that, it's a very different situation. So I'll use the example of South Africa, which I know better. So the Xhosa, which is Nelson Mandela's tribe, have a practice where they'll go out to the bush, and here it's just the boys undergo the rite of passage. I don't believe there's a parallel rite for girls in South Africa, at least not among the Xhosa. And the idea is that they're going to go learn how to become men in their culture. And so they go out, they have all these ceremonial garb is put on. And unfortunately here, it's done in a very unhygienic way. So far from being done in a clinical environment, it's often done in the way that you hear about kind of FGM, where it's like rusty spearheads and stuff like that. And there's lots of infections that happen. Penile amputations are very common. And there's usually about 12 deaths per year just in the Eastern Cape region from complications from the severity of what happens. And so it's this highly traumatic experience, but it's such a cultural imperative that the thought is if you didn't do it, you would be seen as, you don't count as a man until you're circumcised. So even if you're 30 or 40, if you haven't undergone the rite of passage, you'll be ridiculed as a child. And so the peer pressure is so strong to do this that they subject themselves to something that's actually quite dangerous. So that's kind of the far end of the other way that this can be done.
Yeah, sorry, just to interject. So why are we not hearing about these kinds of these deaths and these fatalities or the infections that come from it? Because actually, although I know when a child is in nappies or in diapers, that I mean, kids get poo everywhere. It's unbelievable. Like
Yeah.
the you know, um, why is it that we're not hearing about the infections that result from
Yeah.
male circumcision or the deaths that result from male circumcision? I think in the last 10 years, I've only ever heard of one. That was the Italian case, I think last year or the year before. But other
Mhm.
than that, we never ever hear about. In 12 deaths a year in just that one region is quite a number to be emerging from just one region.
Yeah, so I was trying to find hard statistics about what are the deaths for boys and for girls, at least within the African context. And I found a report by I think the Population Council. And I think one potential difference is just that although different kinds of tissue are removed, less tissue overall is removed in the case of girls just because the organ is smaller. And so if there's going to be an infection, there's less of an open wound surface area. And so I think it may be that a lot of these deaths come from infections from unsterile environments, and also just sometimes from the trauma of the initiation, right? So why do we hear about them differently? Well, one reason is that I think most Westerners don't know when they think of FGM, they think of Africa and they think of girls being singled out, and it doesn't occur to them that in that very same village, the boys are also going through a rite of passage in every case, and it
Mm.
complicates the narrative because the whole idea is it's supposed to. The reason why we're spending billions of dollars and these Westerners are marching into African villages to teach them how to do their culture right is because we say it's a girls' rights issue. And because we're so convicted of that view, it's very complicated if we were to acknowledge that in every same instance where the girls are being circumcised, so too are the boys. And depending on the group, what's happening to the girls or the boys may be more severe. It just messes up the whole logic of that. We have to come up with a very complicated theory now of patriarchy, where it's like, well, when it's done to the girls, it's for bad reasons, and when it's done to the boys, it's for good reasons, and it's tied to all this other stuff. So we just ignore what's happening to the boys in Africa. Now, on the local level, it's not something that people are ignorant of. I mean, it's a major conversation in South Africa every year, what they call the cutting season comes around, and there's always the reports of usually about a dozen boys that die each year, and usually about twice that many penile amputations, and they go to the hospitals, and the doctors there are very concerned about this, and what they find is that it's such a taboo to talk about. So here's part of the reason why is people are aware. I mean, the Department of Health in the Eastern Cape has the statistics every year of how many deaths come about from those that they see in the hospital. There are also people that they think are lost to suicide that they don't necessarily have records of. And it, usually there will be some sort of op-eds in the local newspapers every year saying we really ought to do something about this. We should make sure at least that there's like clean instruments that they use, give them like sterilized razors or something so they aren't using, knives repeatedly on different boys. And then it kind of blows over, and then the next season they have the same conversation. And every once in a while it will leak into like, the BBC will have an article and it's like Africa section or something like that. So people who follow this are aware of this happening, but it doesn't catch the popular attention in the United States, for example. And I think it's because we practice male circumcision. So it's a normalized thing for us. We don't think of it as a problem. And so although we think, well, maybe it's sort of more dangerous in the way they do it in Africa, we don't think that the very practice itself is problematic.
Mm.
Whereas if we hear about genital cutting done, let's say in Malaysia to girls, where it's a relatively minor form, we are outraged because we think, how could any culture be so barbaric as to perform such a practice? So I think something about the influence of U.S. culture on Western consciousness and on the way that discourses are shaped probably affects what most average people think of as normal and as barbaric, or as civilized and as problematic. And that then affects what journalists will write about. They'll write about the things that people think are newsworthy. And it's
Yeah.
newsworthy if a girl is subjected to something that's culturally unfamiliar to us. It's not altogether newsworthy if a boy has something happen to them that happens a million times a year in the United States, but just maybe under less sterile conditions. So I think probably that's part of why there's a different kind of focus.
So that's
It's hard
that's
to say.
kind of
Yeah.
sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So that's kind of the perspective from the US kind of viewpoint. However, we have the same issue here in Britain. So we have very robust laws protecting women and girls from female genital cutting. However, we have no discussion at all about male circumcision. I mean, I train professionals around safeguarding issues and harmful traditional practices, and I've heard social workers say to me, if this was a girl, I would have been able to stop it like that. Whereas when I'm concerned about a boy being circumcised, it's so easy for the parents to just pick them up, take them out of the country and get it done abroad, because they know they're not even going to be stopped. Whereas women and girls, if there's a case that emerges that there is risk, they can be stopped at the airport, their passports can be revoked from them. So why is it so drastically different? I think you already kind of touched on it, but I'm seeing this difference internationally, not just US or certain parts of the world. It seems everywhere that we take it far more seriously. We act more urgently when it comes to female genital cutting. I didn't actually realize that penile amputations were happening as a result of male circumcision. This is completely news to me today, actually. So I've definitely been enlightened. But that's horrific, because that's the argument I've heard from FGM activists is that FGM sexually cripples women and girls, but male circumcision doesn't sexually cripple men and boys. However, if your penis has been amputated, that's going to definitely sexually cripple you. So why is the difference? Why is there such a difference?
Yeah, I mean, so historians and cultural theorists try to explain this, and nobody knows for sure. But my unfortunately late colleague Robert Darby speculates that male circumcision has been familiar to Western culture through its contact with Judaism over a very long period of time, and so there was always kind of a sense of, well, first of all, circumcision had been a flashpoint and a basis upon which Jews were persecuted in many different cultures. So it's not that it was always just a sort of harmonious coexistence. But for the most part, especially kind of, in recent centuries, circumcision has been at least familiar to the consciousness of Westerners when done to boys. Whereas when they heard about female circumcision, it was from these reports coming out of Africa. And so it really fit this whole kind of colonialist narrative of Western superiority, which is that, oh, they do this horrific thing to girls. Some people argue that part of the reason why it was set up this way, too, is that in the 1970s, there was this woman named Fran Hoskin, who was part of a kind of radical feminist movement that was trying to argue for a global sisterhood. And so the argument then in kind of second wave feminism was that patriarchy is a global problem. It's something that's like inherent to the condition of humankind, where men everywhere are dominating women in this kind of binary gender oppression structure. And anthropologists at the time were concerned about projecting this view onto diverse societies that have hierarchies, but they aren't always hierarchies that operate over gender. Sometimes they'll operate over age or seniority. So you might have, in an African village, it might be that the old woman is the one who's the most senior in terms of experience or deference or whatever. And so you had this resistance at the time where people were saying, listen, it seems to be the case that in the United States and in England and some other Western countries, you do indeed have a gender hierarchy, and you do have something like what we classically think of as patriarchy. And you do have forms of gender oppression that happen throughout Africa as well, and all over the world, indeed. But it's just not quite so simple. People who give intersectional analyses, who talk about the various dimensions along which power flow, they were complicating this picture. But at the time when people heard about female genital cutting, it was within this paradigm, which was that it's part of the worldwide oppression of women by men, and that fit the narrative that was rightly salient to people's minds in terms of activism in the United States and England in the 60s and the 70s, where they were trying to contest these kinds of gender oppressive issues in our culture. But then we just have this tendency to export and project our issues on the rest of the world without doing careful anthropology. So I think that's part of what happened. So from the beginning, when female circumcision or cutting became part of Western consciousness, it was as a gender equity issue, and it was seen as part of the oppression of women. Whereas when male circumcision was brought into Western consciousness, it's seen as something that is meant to spiritually elevate the boy. So the whole point is that in Judaism, circumcision is the central covenant of the religion. And there's an irony here, which is only the boys are allowed to participate in the central covenant of the religion. So it's sexist on its face. Girls don't have an equivalent right. Girls aren't initiated into Judaism on equal footing. And there's some scholars who have reflected on that as being potentially an issue of gender equality within Judaism that needs to be sorted out. But so anyway, the symbolic value of what people think about as male circumcision, think about as female circumcision, were just sort of the premises were set differently from the moment the conversation started. And then it's very hard to get rid of a narrative once it's been baked into the culture. And so much subsequent research sort of starts from these premises, and then you get these self-fulfilling research projects. So I think that's part of what's going on. Let's see. okay, on the issue of um, kind of the comparison between male and female genital cutting within England, let's say, there was a case in 2015 that blew this open a little bit. There was a case of a girl who I think was 4 years old, who was in a Muslim family, where it was suspected or alleged that she had undergone some form of genital cutting. And if she had undergone it, it would have been what's called an instance of type 4 on the World Health Organization typology, which is what they call nicking or pricking. So this is where an incision is made into the clitoral hood, no tissue would be removed, but symbolically a drop of blood is meant to be drawn out. And this is significant because in this particular sect of Islam, the thought is that girls also should be allowed to be circumcised, just like the boys. And so in a way, it's an equalizing gesture. Their thought is that Muhammad's innovation over the old Abrahamic covenant was to include girls into this central and important ritual, but to make sure that they were subjected to something that was less severe than what was done to the boys. So there's these hadith, which are these sayings of Muhammad that suggest that, some cutting should be done, but make sure it's not too deep and so forth. And these are contested, and different schools of Islamic jurisprudence debate about whether these are authentic. But in any event, in this particular sect, the thought was girls should have a symbolic gesture where a drop of blood is withdrawn, but no long-term tissue damage. The problem is that's defined as FGM in British law. And so this court comes before the judge, and if it had been proven that she had undergone this procedure, it would have triggered a safeguarding issue, so that both children actually would have been taken away from the parents because they would have been convicted of essentially criminal child abuse. And the judge, Sir James Munby, made this point in the ruling where he said, listen, if she underwent something, it would have been type 4. We don't have any evidence that she did undergo anything, because if you do a minor pricking like this, often the wound heals completely. And so you don't have a scar, you don't have any visual evidence of bodily change. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it's hard to prove. And he says, so let's say that we had proved it. She would have undergone pricking, but she has a brother, like a young brother. And so that means in this family, probably he will be circumcised, and whatever will happen to him will be on any view far more severe than what happened to his sister. I mean, there will be no confusion about whether something happened to his penis. He'll be missing a third of the skin system of his penis, and there'll be a scar, and it will be obvious to everyone. So he says, what are we doing in British law that we say one of these things is significant harm, and if it were proved, we would actually have to take the children away from their parents, which, by the way, is probably bad for children to be taken away from your loving parents. And he says, but in the case of the brother, it's just invisible to British law. We don't know what to do with it. And so that was the first time in sort of Anglo-British law that a judge came out and said, we have very, very inconsistent standards that we apply to genital cutting of girls as to boys. And again, it's just because of stereotypes. When people think of FGM, they think of sexual crippling, as you mentioned. So that refers to like the subset of cases where there's severe damage to the external clitoris such that like nerve tissue is destroyed that's relevant for orgasm or something like that. But that's just a subset of what's done of what we call FGM. Similarly, if you focus on just penile amputations in South Africa, you could say male circumcision is damaging the sexual organ. But you shouldn't cherry pick your examples when you're trying to give a general account of a practice. So you could pick from the opposite end of the spectrum, and you could talk about this ritual nicking, and that clearly doesn't sexually destroy or cripple girls. I argue that it's wrong to do. I think it's wrong to inflict that kind of concentrated risk on this particular part of a person's body. But here's just another way of saying it. When people have an intuition that something's wrong, they often justify that intuition by thinking that something must be very harmful. And so they just assume that the reason why it's wrong is because it's harmful. I think something can be wrong because it's disrespectful. I think something can be wrong because it violates a person's sexual or bodily integrity. And I also think it can be wrong because you're exposing them to risks that they rationally might not want to have concentrated on that part of their body. So I think there's all sorts of reasons why it's wrong to take a sharp object to a child's body.
Yeah. And the other thing I think it infringes on is a person's agency and taking their right to choose. And I think we'll talk about that in a moment anyway. But the other thing I feel like there is a bit of a fetishizing of FGM as well, because some of the extremer versions of FGM entail, completely closing a woman's like vagina off. That it's become a bit of a fetish, so they can't see the kind of different grades. And you're right, a nick compared to removing, a large chunk of the foreskin, you can see that there's a disparity in how we treat this. So I wanted to ask, do you think it's useful then to because I've had this discussion with some friends before, and they think it's not useful to make these comparisons and talk about both the issues at the same time. But I'm sensing from you that it probably is. What would you say about that? Do you think it's useful to talk about FGM and male circumcision at the exact same time to be able to, you know, you talk about these differences and similarities, etc., or do you think that you have to treat them as two separate things and talk about them separately?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a scientific and a moral political reason why I think they should be talked about together. The first reason is that genital cutting is always part of a gendered system, and so if you have an anthropological fact, which is that wherever girls are cut or circumcised, so too are the boys, and it's often done in parallel rites of passage that are symbolically linked to each other, then you can't understand just from a purely scientific, suppose you're like this dispassionate anthropologist just going into these places and you have no judgment. You can't literally understand what you're looking at unless you see how these practices are linked in the minds of the practitioners as part of an overall gendered system. So if you want to understand like how women are situated or girls are situated within a particular group, you can't have a robust understanding of that until you see the way in which symbolic aspects of femininity are linked to symbolic aspects of masculinity and how they're sort of operationalized in the given culture. And so I think from a purely scientific perspective, given that there are no societies that only cut the genitals of girls and always also cut the genitals of boys, if you want to understand what you're even contesting, you have to study them together. But then here's the moral and political reason why I think they have to be studied together. In Western law, this issue of quote unquote minor forms of female genital cutting being prohibited while more extreme forms of male genital cutting are not, is something that is very salient to defenders of male genital cutting. And so prominent defenders of male circumcision recognize that if enough people put two and two together and say, well, wait a minute, we don't even allow a prick to girls, so how can we allow this more extreme thing to boys? That one thing that might happen is people will want to restrict male circumcision, and they don't want that to happen. And so what they're doing is they're now putting arguments out into the bioethics literature, into legal journals, arguing that we should in fact tolerate what they regard as minor female circumcision. Now, so they have intellectual consistency here. I give them credit for not kind of pussyfooting around the issue and having a contradictory view. They think that male circumcision is definitely permissible. They think it's like this rite of this religious ritual that has to be protected. They recognize that it's more severe than some forms of female genital cutting that are religious practices within some sects of Islam. And so they say we should allow the female circumcision as well. So I think that if people, so they're like 10 steps ahead of this argument. They already know that these things are comparable. And so they're now just pumping arguments into the literature in mainstream bioethics journals, like the top ones. And I'm seeing this now, I'm often asked to review papers. And so they'll come through my desk, and I'm seeing people in law journals now arguing, well, male circumcision is obviously permissible, and therefore so is female circumcision. And so what's happening is that when the anti-FGM activists are sort of so intent on saying these things are totally incomparable to each other, and it makes sense why they would say that, because if one of these practices is tolerated in Western society and the other isn't, they have to show that that's somehow justified by saying, well, obviously they're completely different from each other. That, what we're doing is rational and civilized, and what they're doing is barbaric and awful. And the only way we can do that is making sure nobody sees these things as connected. Because if they are connected, we'll have a bigger problem to take on, which is our own cultural practices that may be problematic. And nobody wants to do that. And so there's this mythology that's been created, which is these things are totally separate. So first of all, it's just wrong on scientific grounds. It's not true that they're not connected. They're highly connected in the minds of every society that practices the one. They only have been artificially disconnected in the Western discourse since the 1970s because of the work of Fran Hoskin and early activists who were focusing on the most extreme forms that you mentioned, like infibulation in Northeast Africa, and bringing that in as part of this horror story to Western consciousness. And so that's kind of the general thing that everybody knows. So any average educated person on the street who has a college degree will know that FGM is this horrible barbaric thing and male circumcision is benign. But scholars of these practices know they're linked, and defenders of male circumcision know they're linked. And because they know they're linked, they're now arguing we should tolerate female circumcision. So I and a couple of my colleagues are trying to argue the other thing. We're saying, yeah, they're linked and we should tolerate neither of them. We should just, generally speaking, not be cutting the genitals of children. But it's really hard to fight that battle when you've got people you generally agree with. Like, I agree with the anti-FGM activists that nobody should be cutting the genitals of girls. I completely agree with them on that. But I'm over here trying to fight the next battle. And then I've got, a bunch of people saying they're totally unrelated. How dare you compare them and so forth. And I'm like, guys, they totally are related, and I need your help to contest this other practice because some really smart people over here want to defend male circumcision, and they're going to do it by throwing girls under the bus. So I really feel that people need to draw together on this issue, and it's really regrettable that this narrative is so thick in the minds of the culture that it's almost incomprehensible for people to think that these things could be related. But it's like that ship has sailed, and it's sailed in the legal literature and in the bioethics literature, and we really need to band together people who are interested in kind of children's rights and as you mentioned, the freedom for people to choose about this part of their body. I mean, in every culture, the genitals are constructed as special and as private, and it's the sort of thing that you oughtn't even to allow adults to touch, much less, interfere with in other ways. So a little kid growing up in a Western society that teaches them that lesson and then finds out that when they were at their most vulnerable, somebody took a knife to their genitals, they have a right to be upset by that. That's totally rational for them to say that shouldn't have been done. And so I think we need to just kind of put two and two together and face up to how we want to deal with cultural practices in a secular society.
And I do agree wholeheartedly with you. Actually, it was your talk that I saw at the NSS conference that really forced me to shift my thinking within the space of an hour. I was like, holy shit, I've been getting this really, really wrong. Because of course I'm against both. And I always have been. But I was always so adamant that these two things are so very different. We shouldn't compare them. We shouldn't be having the conversations at the same time. And then listening to that day, I realized actually the more important thing was to be fighting against any harmful traditional practice that does take away people's agency, that does infringe on their rights to choose, their rights to be who and what they want to be. And just funnily enough, just a couple of days ago, I heard an FGM activist. She's a feminist FGM activist and survivor who did like quite an angry rant on Twitter about, I've got all these people contacting me and saying, why aren't you also talking about male circumcision? She was just like, just back off. I'm not going to do it. Yeah. And I remember, I don't think I ever would have worded it like that because I would have been against both, but I would have said, I'm not doing that work. That's somebody else's work. But if the trouble is nobody is doing that work, not public health organizations, not feminist organizations, not domestic abuse or sexual violence organizations, nobody. I remember having a conversation even about FGM with it was a manager in a sexual violence service, and I said to her, before you've even cut the genitals of a child, when you touch them as children, that is sexual violence. And that sat very uncomfortably with her, but it was that at that point that I realized that this is a bit of a tougher battle and it does need a much broader discussion, and we need to be a bit more honest and more comfortable having that discussion, particularly in an era where we've got women's rights activists, I wouldn't say women's rights activists, more so feminist groups that are trying to pit us against each other, men and women against each other, and men and women's issues against each other, to try and continue that very kind of divisive war. I don't think it's useful because we just need to focus on the issue itself. What are your thoughts?
That's such an interesting point. So I think this is one of these issues where people who are concerned about gender equality and are focused on, something that affects boys or something that affects girls, this is a real point of contact, of collaboration potentially, which is totally what we need, right? We don't need this kind of gender wars thing going on where everybody's trying to vilify the other side. In order to have true gender equality, you need to have buy-in from the whole culture. You need to have men and women feeling like they're working together toward an aim where we all can have dignity and respect for our bodily boundaries and so forth. So here's like an obvious example where people could come together. They could say, wow, we have a shared interest in helping young, vulnerable people across the sex and gender spectrum feel like the first lesson they get in life is that your body is your own to make decisions about. And that's something that, if we want to teach boys, for example, people who are interested in advocating against sexual assault and rape, which is something I've been involved in for a number of years as well. The whole thing is that we need to teach boys to be respectful of bodily boundaries. Well, if you have a whole culture that the first thing that happens to boys is you violate their sexual boundaries, what kind of message are you sending? That's not helpful to say, well, your genitals don't deserve protection, but anyway, be very respectful to the genitals of others. So I think it's something where there is a very fruitful collaboration and a shared interest that's here. And I think there's a very positive vision of working toward gender equality that could involve that kind of coming together. Another thing you mentioned was about, what was it? There were some interesting things in what you just said. Maybe I'll maybe they'll come back to me. But yeah, I think you're really on the right track. That this is something that is an opportunity for people to work together. Oh, I remember the thing that what you said that keyed off my thinking. So, so first of all, a lot of the gender roles in many African contexts have been shaped by colonialism in a way where what we now see as certain kinds of gender inequality reflect interventions from Western powers. So certain forms of gender inequality do reflect intervention from colonialist history. Nevertheless, what people see when they see, men have access to the market allows them to have monetary resources that allow them to fulfill certain kinds of needs. Women often seem to be confined to the home life. We have all sorts of assumptions that we draw about what should have value, but nevertheless, people are rightly concerned about forms of inequality when it comes to access to education, for example. And so what happens is when they focus on a female genital cutting, they think that they're fighting a sort of gender equality issue, but they've actually picked one of the worst things in the society to focus on, because that's something that actually is not gender unequal. Both the boys and the girls are circumcised. So you just picked one of the few practices in this entire culture that's done both to boys and girls. So what you should be focusing on is general women's and men's rights in the culture to have equal standing, focusing on education for girls, focusing on access to the market for girls and women so that they can take charge of their own lives and exercise agency. And if you do that, you will really be doing really helpful work. But when you talk to a lot of the women in these societies, they say, why are you so focused on my genitals? They're like, I don't have clean drinking water. They're like, I don't have access to an education. Why are you staring between my legs? Like, I'm fine. This is what's normal for me. Like, this is what we expect. Like, maybe we'll come around and we'll contest this once we've, got an education, but we focus on that. So I think there is this kind of, as you said, this almost voyeuristic fetishization of looking at African women's genitals, ignoring what's happening to the boys' genitals, assuming it's a gender inequality issue, and then ignoring the bigger issues, which is like healthcare and education and other things that are much more deeply rooted sources of gender inequality. But we've treated this as the ultimate symbol of gender inequality based on bad anthropology. And then we just fetishistically focus on this one issue to the exclusion of the broader system within which it's embedded, which is where you do see really important gender equality issues that should be prioritized.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And the thing is, because we're having this conversation, the allegation is going to be leveled at us that we think that that's not the important issue. That's not what we're saying, because I think both of us are against both forms of circumcision. However, there are other issues in those countries, in those parts of the world, in those communities that we need to deal with as well, or beforehand, because then the other discussions happen by themselves. So you're completely right here. So actually, I did want to ask, in terms of law and policy, what is the best approach? So I know Iceland outlawed all kinds of circumcision until the age of 18, and they also stated that they were doing it to preserve the religious freedom of anybody. So up until the age of 18, they couldn't be circumcised, so we couldn't take that decision for them. However, after the age of 18, whatever people want to do to their genitals, they're free to do that. What do you think of that? And if you think that's a good approach, and if so, why? And do you think it's not a good approach, then why?
Your questions are so good, and you're zeroing in on absolutely the most difficult and challenging questions in this realm that scholars are debating all the time, and nobody has a clear answer on what to do. So, yeah, you're asking something that's really at the frontier of this discussion. What happened in Iceland is that since the early 2000s, they've had a law that prohibits genital cutting of girls, that's non-consensual and that's medically unnecessary. So the proposed change to the law was just simply to change the word girls to children. So they're just going to literally change one word. And then this led to this huge outcry because people were uncomfortable with the implications for, I would say, largely Judaism. I think if this were just a Muslim practice and it were not familiar to Western culture and it were not done within Judaism, and either male or female circumcision were coming along with waves of immigration, I think anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-Muslim sentiment would cause both of these practices to be stigmatized. So what do you do legally? I'm not sure criminal law is the right route to pursue actually in either case. So just imagine arresting, say, a Jewish mohel and throwing him in jail for performing, a religious practice that's deeply rooted within Judaism that goes back thousands of years. I think most people would think that would be an outrage. And the reason for that is that to criminalize people is a very particular approach to take. And when it comes to Muslim immigrants who are performing something that goes back thousands of years in their culture, or say African immigrants who may or may not have also an Islamic background, we just don't treat their practices as seriously. So we go, oh, well, this is just some bad habit that's like, gender something. So we'll just throw you in jail. But actually, it's devastating to these communities to have, people who are just as important to the cultural fabric of their community as a mohel may be within a Jewish community to be turned into a criminal, and to have children taken away from their parents, usually based on racial profiling. I mean, usually there's no clear evidence that anything has happened, but you have a lot of disruption of communities based on the criminalizing of parents. And I think there's a real racist component to this, because it's very easy to criminalize people. I mean, we're talking about this in the US with the whole criminal justice system and how Black and brown men are funneled into the role of criminals, because everyone knows it's okay to hate criminals. Criminals you can be discriminatory against. And so, when you got to pay attention to who are the ones who get that status. It's not the white people usually. And so I think criminal law has been applied in a very inconsistent and racist way that has disproportionately disadvantaged African immigrants and also Muslim immigrants from different parts of the world, including India and Pakistan and elsewhere. And so I think what's needed is Western cultures need to get their own house in order. So if we have, if the United States is busy circumcising 1 million boys a year without their consent for no medical reason, it doesn't have any moral standing to be arresting Muslim immigrants for doing something less severe to their daughters for religious reasons. That's just insane. That's like obviously not just. So I think instead of spending billions of dollars marching throughout Africa and wagging our finger at these other cultures for their supposedly barbaric practices, the United States needs to stop cutting its own children. And once it's done that, maybe it can have some moral standing to criticize the practices of other groups. But until it gets its own house in order, it's just sheer hypocrisy. And then in terms of like, how do we actually protect children in the here and now? I think a lot of it has to do with education and with consciousness raising. So I think having an adult conversation where we face up to the commonalities between what we do and what they do, and we agree on, how can we come together and allow communities to find reforms within themselves that are led by reformers from within the communities, rather than by kind of holier than thou moralists from outside who haven't even bothered to do their homework and don't even remotely understand the practice they're criticizing, which is what unfortunately is like the global health agenda right now. It's all driven by Western actors who have very little anthropological knowledge about the practices in other countries, who haven't even got, they're not spending half as much time focused on what's going on in the United States. Why not? That's like, because there's asymmetrical power in terms of who has bargaining power in global health agencies. But this is such an old story. Like, that's something we should be very alert to, when the cultural practices of the powerful group are seen as invisible and normal, and the cultural practices of the less powerful group are seen as a problem that needs to be eradicated at any cost. It's like, we should be very concerned when we see that pattern. And yet people are so convinced that they're just fighting, the Lord's fight or something, and they don't pause to think that they're rooted in hypocrisy.
So that's the end of my questions, actually. Do you have any final comments? Any final
I just appreciate your very thoughtful and informed and sophisticated questions. And I think this is exactly what the world needs. It's just I don't know all the answers. All I know is that it's complicated, and I don't have the option of resorting to kind of simplistic stereotypes to just shear off one whole group of people and suggest that what they do is bad and everything else is fine. And so I don't think we should be throwing people in jail. I do think we should be having this kind of conversation. So I really appreciate your effort to create circumstances in which we could do that. So thanks very much for this interview.
Well, thank you. Actually, so there's the slight difference with the US and the UK, because we don't have medicalized circumcision of boys in the UK. And in Britain, largely it is Muslim and Jewish communities that do this practice. And I remember hearing from a journalist who has been trying for a couple of years to do something about the issue of circumcision in Britain. And he said the strongest opposition is from the Jewish community. It's not as strong from the Muslim community. There's some opposition, but it's not as strong. So that was an interesting thing to hear. And he was based in Wales, and he's still kind of struggling through that. And he couldn't find, like we've mentioned a couple of times, he couldn't find any feminist groups that would support him and back his kind of campaign to try and stop male circumcision as well.
There's one feminist group I'm aware of called Terre de Femme in Germany that has taken this on as a sort of children's rights and gender equality issue. And I think they're very brave to kind of take on this particular issue. But it's true. I think people are very concerned that there's going to be a lot of resistance, particularly from Jewish groups, because they're concerned about eight days. In Islam, there's no particular prescription about when it has to happen. So at least conceivably, you could defer until later in the teenage years or something like that. And so a lot of people just don't want to touch this because it's too politically difficult. And I think it's very brave for those groups that have. But the more such groups that stand up and say this isn't about what shape your genitals are, but whether you're vulnerable and whether you got to make a choice. And let's come together to try to fight for children. I think the more groups that do that, it will lead to a kind of paradigm shift. And I hope that happens in the coming years. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Brian. So where can people find you if they want to follow you, or if they want to get in touch with you? How can they find you?
Sure. I'm pretty active on Twitter. Brian David Earp, I think, is my handle. And then I have an academia.edu page where I try to put all of my papers on genital autonomy are there for free, so people can read them at their leisure.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.